The following podcast is a deep, shallow dive production.
And you're gonna love it.
Okay, let's go.
Man, I'm really glad we finally got this to work, because I've told you this offline and I'm going to tell it to you online. As far as the quality of content and bringing receipts, right now it's Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and James Lee.
Hey, that's a big compliment. I appreciate you saying that. I don't know if I'm quite there yet, but on the road.
Absolutely.
On the journey.
Absolutely. All right, listen, everybody, we've got a great guest today. And is that how you pronounce your last name, Lee? Okay, so James Lee, this is honestly one of my favorite content creators. I discovered him, ironically, through my brother on Instagram. And my brother sent me a note and he's like, dude, you've got to check this guy out. He does really, really good in-depth analysis on things, and he brings receipts. And I started checking you out, and honestly, I've been absolutely blown away. And so I know you're a little pressed for time today. So I'm just going to go topic by topic. And seriously, the good thing about the Deep Shallow Dive audience is they're pretty up to date, hopefully, on kind of what's going on in terms of, the zeitgeist of pop culture and the zeitgeist of what's going on geopolitically. Really, today's all about getting your real opinion. And let's start with Luige Mangione. So first of all, do you think he's the shooter? And give us your take on that whole thing.
Yeah, I've looked into this quite deeply in terms of, there's different layers, I think, of conspiracy and analysis to this whole thing. And based on what I've seen, I do believe that he is the shooter. I know some of the people are pointing out, hey, the backpack looks different, or the eyebrows don't look quite the same, and this and that, and based on the blurry, but a lot of it is kind of blurry footage compared to what, he is looking like in a high quality video or a camera shot that we're seeing now. But I just think that it probably is him. Although the one part where I have some doubts is in terms of the amount of evidence that they found on him when they caught him at that McDonald's, right? Because I was thinking, if I was the shooter, I would probably immediately get rid of the evidence, like the gun. Yeah. Or I wouldn't carry around the manifesto that I had and all of these motives, right? They basically found him with the weapon, with the motive. And so that's, checkmate. And so that part is a little weird in terms of how well it came together and how, all the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted. That part was odd. So that either he's, in terms of a larger conspiracy, hey, he could be a part of a more, he could not be acting alone, right? There's other things that could be happening, right? Because he had to learn about where the CEO was, right? That investor meeting, while it was released publicly as far as it was taking place, nobody knew publicly where it was. So he had to have gotten some insider information. And the second thought I had was, so either he's working maybe with other people, that's possible, or that he just wanted to get caught. This is all part of his thing. It seems like he was pretty active online. And he maybe just wanted that to go down that road where he's going to get caught. It looks like there's going to be a massive trial, right? Could be possibly definitely the trial of the year, but trial of the decade here with the amount of coverage that it's going to get. So that's my thought process. I think he is the guy, to summarize, but there could be some larger things in the background, such as him working with other people that we don't yet know about.
No, you know what? That makes total sense. I didn't think about the concept of him wanting to get caught and wanting to be this. To me, this whole situation it's two things. Is he that guy? And I totally agree with you. I do think he is the person in the video shooting, because the reason I think that is, it's just too easy to prove if you're not that guy. Like, I would be like, I'd say to my lawyer, here's my GPS location from my phone. I was in Pennsylvania at 6:45 in the morning on that Monday or Tuesday, And then the other thing is, it's like anytime I'm in fresh air with my handcuffs, I'd be yelling at the top of my lungs, I didn't do it. I'm not the shooter. I wasn't even in New York at that time. It's too easy if you're getting pinned with that kind of murder and you didn't do it, to just be like, dude, that was not me. And here's 12,000 pieces of proof, from the get-go. As far as, the funny thing is, as far as then, okay, it doesn't make sense like that he got caught at that McDonald's with all the evidence on him. It's like the dude went from being Jason Bourne to Jason Segel, who's on my favorite show, Shrinking. It's like you went from like this super ninja, elite killer to like a dipshit that has all the evidence on you and you're at a McDonald's. Like, yeah, dude, that stuff doesn't make sense. Any thoughts on the bigger picture of what's going on with that, in terms of, like, I know you've done some research on really how the healthcare systems, screwed people over, but to finish out on Luigi, I mean, any thoughts on just the bigger discussion that's being had here?
Well, I think the bigger discussion that's really important that the public should know about is the charge that's brought against him is not just murder, but it's also terrorism. And I think we have to talk about that in that sense, because why is it terrorism and why are they choosing to do that? Because to me, it definitely is murder, right? For example, if we look at maybe some other high profile assassinations or assassination attempts, one that comes to mind is Trump. And I tweeted this out a few days ago and I've got a little bit of traction because I was just merely pointing out, okay, let's say the shooter had survived in the Trump assassination attempt. I didn't hear anything there about that being terrorism. To me, that's the same thing. You're doing pretty much the same thing there. And I think they brought about the terrorism is because there is this underlying level of dissatisfaction against the system and revolutionary type of feeling that people have because everybody feels like they're getting screwed over all the time by, whether it be health insurance companies or pharmaceutical companies or whatever. Big food is another one that's potentially, putting toxic things in our food to make us sick where they can make more money. So a lot of people are fed up. So they want to make sure that, hey, we're going to try to put a lid on this thing. And that's where we should really be careful, because this could really usher in a massive police state that is really not necessarily even governmentally controlled, but it's from the corporate perspective where their interests have now elevated even beyond the elected officials and government, where we're protecting them more than, a former and now president-elect of the United States. It seems like his life, the CEO's lives, are more important than the lives of presidents, which I find to be kind of disturbing.
That's interesting. So your tweet talked about, why is this being labeled terrorism, or why is there a terrorism charge when that was never even brought into the discussion with Trump, whom you would think if terrorism existed, it would go up against a president versus a CEO. That could be ushering in Patriot Act 2.0 or
Right.
3.0 or whatever version we're on now. No, that's a great point. Was there any interesting Twitter feedback on that? Did anybody?
I think a lot of people sort of agreed that I think there's something subversive going on where now they're making it almost impossible or very, very difficult to even criticize corporations. I don't know if you probably followed that story of the lady on the phone with an insurance company, and she said, deny, defend, oppose. And she said, you guys are next, which people said that's a threat. I see it as somebody being pissed off in customer service, because I think we've all been there at some point in our lives being pissed off at a customer service agent and saying, fuck you and this and that or whatever.
Totally.
And now they're saying that is potentially domestic terrorism as well. So it's almost making it impossible to even criticize a corporation. Like, what is next? This is definitely, to me at least, a slippery slope where, civil liberties are now being infringed on just because of speech, right? She didn't do it. This is now getting into minority report status, which is, we don't want to go there. And so I think that's what's going on right now. Kathy Hochul the other day, she had what they're calling a therapy session with 175 CEOs. And to me, it seems, and then also I've heard that I don't know if it's going to be done or not, but she vocally brought up how maybe they're going to apply some state resources to protecting and increasing security on these executives. And I'm like, why is taxpayer money going into this at all? That just seems, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with Luigi's motives or whatnot, this seems like a misappropriation of funds from the taxpayer perspective. And it just seems like they're using this to further clamp down on the population.
No, absolutely. And what's interesting is you've got Kathy Hochul, Democratic governor of New York. And so let's see let's see what Trump decides to do on this. There's a lot of rubber meets the road that I'm going to try and hold Trump accountable to, and we'll talk about that in a second. But going on the misappropriation of taxpayer money, let's talk about Ukraine and Israel. And I want your thoughts there.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot there, but for me, from my perspective, the wars, they go back a long ways, right? Especially, if you look at Ukraine, right? That was something that was brought about, and I don't know all the details to this, but what I do know, it wasn't an unprovoked war that just
That's right.
happened.
That's right.
Right. There's a long history of the U.S. getting involved in that region. And I think that probably the easiest analogy I can make is that if, Russia is starting to put, their tanks and their missiles in Mexico, I think the U.S. would be very alarmed by that. And they would probably say, you guys got to cut the shit or we're going to do something. And that's kind of what happened there as well. And I know there's different, there's other interests as well, the natural resources with the minerals and also Russia. They have their own interests as well. But the question is whether or not we should be getting involved in these things and how much of our money is going there versus, I think that the starkest contrast is what we saw with the natural disasters, right? It seemed like we have no problems appropriating money to go to Ukraine, billions and billions of dollars at a time, but they're having trouble just getting, a couple $100 million for FEMA and getting, a couple $100 to people whose livelihoods have been wiped away. So when I see that Americans aren't the priorities of the American government, that's when you start to really question what's happening in there, what influences they have. And that's where, I think the Israel question comes into play is why are we so committed to defending them at every corner? What's happening? And I know a lot of your audience probably knows about the influences of the Israeli lobby and how much you could say, influence or control Congress.
Yeah.
And why are we unable to speak out against it? Because I think it's coming in the pipeline here, probably in this administration, given Trump's, the $100 million from Miriam Adelson. We're probably going to see some bill that's going to try to go through Congress where it's going to be impossible or it's going to outlaw criticizing the Israeli government.
Yeah, which is insane. And I've talked about this a lot on the podcast. I've talked about, a guy that I know you like, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, on Mearsheimer, Professor John Mearsheimer. Like, I've brought those guys up a ton. And in terms of Ukraine, people do need to understand that, this did not start in 2022 with, Putin's brutal invasion. It's like, it's funny. I think once you have a perspective that you have, or maybe that I have, or just when you're paying attention, you start to see the marketing slogans, and they really are. They're like brand campaigns. And I feel like that Putin's brutal invasion. I mean, gosh, if I had the resources, I'd have an intern go back and pull how many times, news outlets played that, or Biden said that, or all those guys said that. But that entire situation, you've got to understand who Viktor Yanukovych is. You've got to understand what happened in 2008 at the NATO meeting where Obama basically said, hey, we're going to let Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And like you said, if Russia set up bombs and tanks on the Canadian border and the Mexican border, we'd go ballistic. I mean, it would be the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again. But no, I'm with you on that. AIPAC is something, the Israeli lobby and their influence. I've talked a little bit about Thomas Massey, and he did a great episode with Tucker Carlson and, kind of laid that out. But, it's interesting. People still don't really understand, how powerful that really is. And, you mentioned Miriam Adelson donating $100 million to Trump. In my opinion, some of the cabinet picks we've seen from Trump, it's a quid pro quo. It's like, okay, here's Pete Hegseth. I think that dude is trash. Here's Marco Rubio. I think that dude is trash. But they're super pro-Israel. And that's kind of the give. Now, whether they'll be, passed through Senate confirmations, I don't think Trump even cares, because he's like, hey, I put in who you want. It's not my fault that they didn't pass. So any wrap up thoughts on that whole situation, AIPAC, all that, like helping people understand really how powerful this is?
Extremely powerful. And a quick comment about his cabinet. I think, yeah, if you look through all his
Yeah.
picks, they have one thing in common, which is they're all pro-Israel. I don't think there is one exception in there, to be quite honest with you. But I think they'll probably get through most of those guys. And as far as the Israeli lobby, one thing that we'll have to see in the coming years as more people become more aware of the Israeli lobby is if they're able to still do the same things out in the open. Because I think one thing that Mearsheimer talked about is that the lobby works the best when we don't know it exists and the way when they're able to make deals in the background.
Absolutely.
But now they're
Absolutely.
bragging about it on social media about how, putting out basically marketing billboards to say, hey, 99% or 100% of the candidates that we endorse have won. Being pro-Israel is good for, politics and good for, your election. That could be very easily interpreted as, oh, well, I guess Israel controls who goes
Yeah.
into Congress and who goes out of Congress. And people will become uncomfortable. I think people as Americans will be uncomfortable with any foreign nation having that kind of influence. Because, right, imagine if it was China. Imagine if China said, hey, every member of Congress that we like wins their election. It would be insane.
Absolutely. That's a great analogy. That'll kind of lead me to the next topic. And I totally agree. I feel like they had such a good thing going. And when I say they, I'm talking about this gigantic collective right now. I feel like they had such a good thing going and they opened up Pandora's box with Gaza, like
Yeah.
with this situation with the Palestinians. Like prior to October 7th, I don't think 99% of America probably didn't even know where Gaza was and had no idea that Palestine ever had been a country or had no clue about anything in that region. So it's kind of crazy that, and maybe they didn't intend to do it, but man, they've opened up Pandora's box and now people are starting to question everything and go back and question, JFK assassination, 9/11,
Yes.
like all that stuff. It's almost like everyone's like, hey, wait a minute. None of this makes sense. So let's go back and figure out what else doesn't make sense. Let me
And I
let
think
me
that,
ask.
sorry, the
Yeah,
last thing I'll say about that, and I think is important to say, is that the most sinister part of this whole thing is the Israeli government's willingness, or the Zionists in general across the world, their willingness to sacrifice sort of the diaspora Jewish community to get what they need to get done. Because what they're basically saying is that if you don't support Israel, you hate Jews, you're
yeah,
anti-Semitic. And a lot of Jewish people who I've talked to don't agree with that. They don't think these two things should be linked. You should not be linking a religion to the conduct of a government or a military, right? I've talked to an anti-Zionist Jew, and she said one of the most disappointing things is that, how the Star of David is being used. You see it on the uniforms of the IDF, and she's basically saying you're co-opting and you're weaponizing the religion. And now all I see when I see the Star of David isn't, the religion and all these things that come with it and all the, I'm not Jewish, so I don't know all the background of it, but it's not to do with the culture and the customs that we have that are really beautiful. It's now associated with an Israeli soldier standing over, dead Gazan children. And that is now the image that not only she has, but the public has as well. That symbol no longer means what it used to mean. And so I think that's the part where, man, if you really think about it, when they keep saying that Israel is the only safe place for Jews, I think a strong argument could be made that they actually make the world much more dangerous for Jewish people.
no, absolutely. I mean, some of my closest friends are Jewish and feel that exact same way. And then you look at people like, you look at Bernie Sanders, you look at Jon Stewart, you look at Dr. Gabor Mate, you look at Norman Finkelstein, you look at all these, like when a Jewish person says that, to me, that's credible. You know what I mean? Because I'm not Jewish either. So I
Yeah.
don't have skin in that game. So it really doesn't necessarily matter what I think about it. But when these prominent and, in my opinion, intelligent, articulate, well-researched, who else? Gideon Levy, some of these guys that are scholars, like they're true scholars. Even, I'm not sure if Professor Jeffrey Sachs is Jewish or not, but like the guys that truly are scholars, when they critique the difference between a religion and a political ideology, that's where I think you need to listen to that, because it makes a lot of sense. It absolutely does. All right, let's move on to our guy, Donald John Trump. What are
Okay.
your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on this, dude? And before you answer, I've said to my audience 100 times, I'm a registered independent now. I used to be a Democrat. Then I became a Republican during COVID because honestly, I just liked the Republicans' stances on COVID. And then I became an independent because honestly, I don't like the Republican stance on, for example, Gaza and all of that. It's like, it's goofy how united they are when it comes to that stuff. And it's almost like they've lost a little sense of humanity. So I've become a registered independent. And when I talk about Trump, I've categorized it into two things. There's like Trump derangement syndrome, which has been talked about a lot, and a lot of people definitely have that. But then the other one, and I think I've coined this, there's Trump worship syndrome as well, where people just worship the dude and it doesn't matter what he does. Everything is good, or they'll find a way to justify it to being good. So I wanted to preface that so you feel comfortable saying whatever you want to say about him, and just kind of, give us your thoughts on him, the election, what you think is going to happen with his presidential term this time. And then we'll go from there.
So it's hard to say what will happen with Trump in general because he's sort of an unpredictable guy, which is what some of his appeal is. Although I will say on the Israel issue, I think it's very clear what will happen there just because there's just so much evidence of that already. But as with some of the other things, I just think that some of the realignment has really shifted what we think today of the modern Republican Party and the modern Democrat Party, right? So now, you see one of the things is some of the followers that I have, and I see this person as, they're very hippie, they're all about holistic living and eating well and yoga and this and that. And they're Trump supporters. These guys are, if you look at this descriptor of a person, if you go back 10, 20, 30 years, they would be Democrats. They're like hippies, right? Now,
Totally.
They're shifted into the Republican Party because I think the Democratic Party, I think maybe it traces, I think, back further to maybe Clinton days. But I think it's been a 20, 30-year transition. And I think it was solidified during COVID that the Democratic Party is the party of the elite, the ruling class, corporations in a lot of ways with their enforcement of, basically pharmaceutical talking points and making sure that those messages are the ones being amplified. Any kind of anti-pharma, you could call it just challenging the status quo of modern scientific consensus is thought of as repulsive to the party. You could see it through the Bernie years where they essentially, if you weren't a part of every single thing that they believed, you were a problem for them, right? If you, let's say you agree with them on 95% of issues, but you're not there on, say, I don't like the idea of having gender neutral bathrooms. I think bathrooms should remain man and woman from that standpoint. If you just disagreed with them on that one issue, you're basically a bigot and potentially a Nazi, and you're out. And so that creates an environment where people like me, I don't want to be a Democrat. I grew up, supporting the Democratic Party in a lot of ways, even though I was always more like independent thinking. But in general, we were taught that the Democratic Party was better for humans and Republican Party was evil. But now you see a really big shift in that the Republicans, they are the only ones who are more willing to talk about, they're paying respects to, the food industry and how that's a big problem. And there's chronic disease and how we need to figure that out. And the Democrats don't really want to talk about that at all. And so this is where the back to your question about Trump, this is where we'll have to see how Trump 2.0 is going to govern, because he could do exactly the same as Trump 1.0, where he talked a lot about the swamp and trying to drain the swamp. But in the end, he just put in the same swamp creatures who were already there before and nothing really changed. Or we'll see if Trump 2.0 is able to play a more, centrist type of role where he's going to try to balance a lot of the corporate influence that does exist within the Republican Party with some of the more, working class, and you can call it the RFK crowd, right? That crowd coming in to join the MAGA movement. How is he going to balance that? Is he going to be able to do that effectively? And then you also got the Elon Musk guys that are also in his ear, where you saw how effective they are just yesterday at killing the government funding bill.
The spending bill.
The spending bill got killed because, he went crazy on X, and then the Republican Party was like, oh, okay, let's take a beat and let's see what we can do here. So there's a lot in this coalition, right? This is a very new-ish coalition for the Republican Party that they've coalesced in this election cycle of not only the traditional Republicans, but now you have the MAGA, the Make America Healthy Again movement. You got some more of that working class. You got increased in numbers of Latinos supporting the Republican Party. So how is he going to really balance that out? That's going to be tough to say, at least from my perspective. I don't know, but I do want him to succeed. A lot of people don't want him to succeed. And then that's just, I think it's anti-American. I want our president to succeed, no matter who he or she might be. And when they talk about tariffs, right? A lot of people say, well, tariffs, they're going to cause inflation, blah, 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 and this and that. And I just think, well, didn't we have like extremely high inflation during the Biden years that, we didn't have tariffs going on? So what if the tariffs do what, they want it to do? Let's say they want to bring manufacturing back to the United States. They want to have a more isolationist type of policy. What if that works? Let's try to make that work. Let's see if that can work. I don't know. I'm not an economist, so I don't know exactly. But it seems like a lot of people are just kind of reacting off of what he does. Whatever he says is no good. And then you can see that with some of the RFK proposals as well, with, let's say, taking fluoride out of water, right? They're saying, oh my God, that is such craziness. But then if you look into it, many countries don't even do that. So if many countries don't do that, how could you say that is, conspiracy theory, or it's so out of the bounds of conversation? So it seems like a lot of people are just reacting and taking the opposite position of what he wants to do, and just automatically tarnishing, that idea.
No, I totally agree. And that goes to that, and I try to seriously myself, and then anyone I talk to, I'm like, dude, get out of your head about Trump. Like, if you have Trump derangement syndrome, bury it. If you have Trump worship syndrome, bury it. At the end of the day, something like Make America Healthy Again, why are we not all on the same team with that? Like, what is wrong with that? So like a guy like RFK, is he really going to be able to do that? The funny thing about Trump is, like, he says we're going to make America healthy. RFK, my guy, Oz is here. And then he's like, I just had dinner with the CEO of Pfizer, and, great guy. We're going to do some good stuff. It's like, dude, no, like, they're the ones that you did a great piece on autism, the rise of autism being correlated with the rise of vaccines. I actually played it on a podcast episode, and I got a lot of people that were like, oh my God, there seems to be a linear rise to these two things. So I think the question is going to be, is he going to do it? Is Trump 2.0 going to actually drain the swamp? Is he going to get rid of the trash Republicans like Lindsey Graham, like Speaker Mike Johnson? This guy's ridiculous. But then Trump walks out. He's at UFC with Dana White and Mike Johnson. Like, that's the stuff that makes me step back and be like, oh, Jesus, are we getting the wool pulled over our eyes in terms of that?
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see what happens with that. I think it hinges on two competing, I think, natural, what do you call, like his instincts, whether he wants to really be loved because he loves being adored, right? So then that means he has to do some things for the people, or is he going to go back to, more selfish kind of motivations that you see, that the critique of the Trump administration is that, oh, well, they're just going to go in and they're going to deregulate everything and make the rich people richer. So those are the competing things that I think that he is going to have to grapple with, because I think if he comes in and he continues the wars, right, if those wars continue to go on and escalate, that's going to be a broken promise as far as being an anti-war candidate. And then he also has made promises in regards to making, reforming the food and pharmaceutical system. So those things continue to go on. That's going to be, I don't think people are going to like that. And the cool thing that I'm seeing right now online is that some of the newer people within the MAGA coalition aren't as sycophantic as the previous years. And now I see more people who are Trump supporters who are willing to call out some of his cabinet picks, or some meeting that he had, like you just mentioned, with Pfizer. These things like that are now being called out versus, and I think in the past we see more of a rationalization of why he had that meeting. Well, he's trying to play the 4D chess game and this and that.
Yeah.
Even.
Yeah.
And so that's a good sign, for at least for me, that I'm seeing, is that people are more willing to challenge him and want him to do the things that he has promised to do.
So do you think, like, is he going to release the Epstein files, the Diddy list? Like, are we ever going to see this stuff, or probably not?
Probably that. I would say I wouldn't hold my breath for that kind of thing. He's talked about the JFK files as well.
Yeah.
And I just don't know if he's able to do that, because I think this is a conspiracy theory completely, but I think one of the reasons that, I don't think, in terms of his assassination attempt, I do not think it's a lone gunman situation. I think there was much more behind that incident, and it's shown very quickly of how quickly they stopped talking about that and moved on.
Yeah.
Which is bizarre.
Let me ask you this,
Yeah.
because I thought it was weird how quickly they stopped talking about it. And I thought it was weird how Trump and the Republicans stopped talking about it. Even to this day, it's almost like it never happened. You know what I mean? So, like, could they all been in on that? Could that have been a momentum play where, I don't know, man, that whole thing was just off to me. It was off.
It's hard to say exactly what it was. It definitely isn't what we were told by the media.
Yeah.
And this is all kind of speculation from my part, and just trying to piece together some pieces of evidence that we have, is that it seems possibly like it could be a deep state type play to take him out and replace him with a much more war-friendly candidate like a Nikki Haley, who would be up next in line. There was some reporting that they had ready to go. I think it was Iran, blaming the assassination attempt on Iran, which would be very good for a certain ally that we have that we talked a lot about. And it didn't, I don't think there are people, this is more on the left and liberal Democrat side, saying that was just a staged assassination attempt in order to increase his popularity. I don't think that's true. I mean, somebody died. There was actual death. I don't, and also just the precision it would take to fire the bullet.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just too close. I don't think that's plausible. I think they really did try to take him out, and it was maybe by the grace of God that he survived.
Okay.
But you do have to question how many people were involved in that attack, right? It certainly didn't seem like that was the only guy. It seemed like there's definitely some agents within the Secret Service or local law enforcement who were compromised, and you can easily tell that they're obfuscating, because if you listen to part of that, I don't know what you call it, but the hearing in Congress or deposition, or the Kim Cheadle, I think was her name. She was clearly hiding things, saying she didn't know about this, and why wasn't there people on the roof? Well, she said the roof was slanted, but there were other roofs that people were positioned on that were also slanted, perhaps even more slanted. So she was lying up there. And I think part of her resignation was to say, all right, we've found the bad person. She's responsible. Let's get rid of her and let's move on from this. Trump survived. There's no harm, no foul. Let's move forward. And I think from Trump's perspective, and this is still me speculating, is that he kind of does rely on these guys to protect him. So he doesn't want to make an enemy out of the Secret Service. His safety is reliant on these people being there for him. So I think he has to toe a fine line with what he can say and what he can't say there.
I got it. I'm with you. All right. You know what? That actually makes sense. And now that I think through that, if, let's say, Team Trump was in on it, they probably would have kept talking about it more and more and more, and gotten more mileage out of it. So, okay. Hey, this is why it helps to kind of talk things out. Absolutely. Dude, I have so many things I want to cover with you, because you've talked about so many good stuff. All right, let's get into this TikTok thing, because I know TikTok is a big platform for you. I mean, what are your thoughts? What's going to happen with this?
That's a good question. So I actually just got off. They just did a call with one of the lead attorneys representing TikTok and a bunch of TikTok creators, explaining the case. I have also recently interviewed one of the First Amendment policy experts from the Knight Institute at Columbia University, just trying to get more context as far as whether this is a First Amendment violation or not. If we zoom out a little bit, right, if we look at the government's reasoning, right, they say this is a national security issue and China is taking the data. And also, this is potentially harmful for Americans because of the algorithm, and China could be brainwashing people's perspective on various issues. So those are the two things that the US government have brought up. There's no evidence. They haven't released any evidence of these two claims, right? They have the DOJ report that was released months ago. 90% of it was redacted. They would say, well, here is why is the evidence of why China, that proves China is stealing data. Below that, completely redacted. We don't know what it is, which is interesting. And so if you were to ask me, hey, do I think China is taking the data? They probably are taking the data, but everybody's taking the data.
Everybody's taking the data. Exactly.
Everybody's taking the data. And even if the company is American, let's say it's Meta, that data is then being sold to various data brokers, and it's finding its way to the hands of the Chinese government, no matter what. So if data really was the motivating factor here, they would just do more. They would limit the type of data companies could collect on its users. That would be the easiest way to do it. And then in terms of, the First Amendment issue, or in terms of the manipulation of, through the algorithm, it's not clear why the app would need to even be banned, because couldn't you just announce that this is a Chinese app and you guys are being brainwashed? Like, that disclosure is what is necessary. What you usually should do in these situations. It's not to ban the app. It's like the analogy is like, let's say the New York Times is printing stuff that, the government doesn't like. And then we'll get to, the broader thing here. And it's kind of saying that, instead of saying, oh, the New York Times, you can't talk about this issue, we have to actually just remove the New York Times from circulation completely. And that's kind of what's happening here. And so I think in terms of the TikTok ban, it really has to do with the content that's proliferating on the app. I think, the users skewing younger, they're a little bit less indoctrinated on, the U.S. foreign policy, narrative talking points and various issues. And so there's more videos on there that take a more pro-Palestinian position. There's more, you could call it, anti-Ukraine sentiment happening. People don't like that. And so what the government is saying is, hey, these things are very bad for, what we want to do or what we try to get the public to believe. And so we need to remove it. That's been said a ton of times by members of Congress as reasoning of why we need to ban the app. So I believe that is really why it's being banned. And then if we want to talk about predictions of whether or not how the Supreme Court will rule, in the past, they've typically sided with the First Amendment on these kinds of issues. But this is sort of an unprecedented case of this app being so popular. It's never, if you talk about newspapers in the past, I don't think they even had the amount of influence that TikTok has today in terms of the number of users, right? I don't think there's been any newspaper with 170 million people in circulation. In this case, TikTok uses 170 million Americans. So the court could potentially break precedent and say, well, this is so new and so unprecedented, all these technologies, because all these case laws, from my understanding, dates back to, the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
So it's a completely different technological landscape today. And we don't really know how they're going to rule.
No, totally. A lot of that case law is not even applicable to this. And I will say, I've changed my thinking about TikTok. I remember 4 years ago when Trump was wanting to ban TikTok going into the 2020 election, and then like Senate hearings. And I remember posting something from, Josh Hawley, where he talked about how dangerous TikTok was. And I remember posting it to my network being like, hey, if your kids are on TikTok, you might want to monitor this. And now, 4 years later, honestly, TikTok is like one of my number one places I go to research things. And exactly what you said, man, there are content creators that are putting ridiculously well thought out content about so many things, but it's the things that maybe a certain group doesn't want you to hear. Gaza, JFK, 9/11, the Osama bin Laden manifesto went crazy on it. And people were like, wait a minute, dude's not saying that much bad stuff. Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein. Wait a minute, what really happened with Saddam Hussein? Why did we kill that dude? He had nothing to do with 9/11. Like, this shit is hilarious. And it's hilarious in that Pandora's box is open, man. It is open. All right, let me ask you this because we kind of talked about Facebook and Meta a little bit. This whole misinformation, the Facebook police, like, have you had any of your content kind of either taken down or have you gotten strikes on Instagram? I know for Deep Shallow Dive, I was in Instagram jail for like 90 days and it really affected the reach of my content. So have you experienced any of that? And then give us your thoughts on the reality of that, Facebook Meta police and then Google as well, maybe with YouTube.
Yeah. So I will say, so I haven't gotten as much overt censorship on Meta or YouTube as compared to TikTok. I think TikTok is actually very censorious because they're dealing with a situation where they're about to be banned. So they're much more proactive about taking down content faster. I've had a lot of videos on TikTok been taken down for various violations. Some of it is not, I would say, ridiculous because I think they just apply random stuff to get your thing taken down. The other day I made a video about the food industry and its ties to the tobacco industry, just all very well-researched stuff. And it was taken down for nudity. There was no nudity in that. Yeah. So it's still down and it did quite well before it was taken down. But if you compare it to Meta and YouTube, I'm a little bit of a smaller creator. I don't have as many followers on there, so I don't know if that plays a role. But I would say YouTube, I have noticed if I do talk about topics that are related to Israel, the content isn't taken down, but I can see the algorithm works slightly differently. I had a recent video that actually talked about the TikTok ban. I had another video that went into the USS Liberty. And for those videos, I noticed that if we look at the metrics in terms of the click-through rate and the watch time, they're both above average in those two regards, which would mean that the algorithm should push that more, right? Because that's what they tell us is that we care about your click-through rate. We want people to click on it, and we want people to watch it for a long time and stay on the app. And those are the two things. And if you do well there, it's going to work. But in those two videos, I had above average click-through rate, above average watch time, but below average view count compared to my other videos. So that leads me to believe there's something happening there, maybe a thumb on the scale. And so that's one thing that I noticed. On Instagram, I'm not sure, maybe because I only have about 27,000 followers on there. So I'm not a massive account. And so I haven't seen any kind of major censorship or suppression of my content there. And it could be due to the size. And I guess the one overarching comment I'll make about censorship and suppression on Meta and Google is that those two platforms are very much tied into intelligence and national security, and these folks, they're all kind of one and the same. I've made videos about this, right? There's a lot of people coming in and out of these organizations that are tied to one another. So I think the way they do content moderation is a little bit different than TikTok. It's a little bit more subversive in a way where maybe they'll not take it down entirely. They'll wait till you get big, and there's like fail safes in the background is what I'm saying. When a person gets big enough, they'll say, okay, we're not going to deal with this anymore. So it's a little bit of a, I guess, I don't know how to describe this, but it's more in the background.
I see what you're saying.
They're kind of monitoring it. And until you make a big, because these are these are entrenched platforms. So unless you're a big creator on there, then maybe something will happen to you in that regard.
I got you.
Right. Does that make sense?
I learned a lot from your video that helped me understand how many former CIA employees work for Facebook now or work for Google now. It's so interesting. They have all that network together, and that definitely does make sense. All right, let me ask you a couple things on a couple topics. The USS Liberty, I haven't really talked about that too much on the podcast yet, but lately, Candace Owens just did a big episode with, I think it's the same guy that's making the rounds. He was on Jake Shields, the UFC guy. He's got a really good podcast and a good take. So can you just give us a little bit of an overview and then your thoughts on that USS Liberty thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the guy you're referring to is Phil Turney. He was an officer aboard that ship. And I actually interviewed him too a few months ago for Breaking Points. And this is where I think it's a big difference because of in studio versus just because I had a remote interview with him.
Yeah.
And this is just tying back to our earlier point when you have we're talking off air about that. But if you have a big podcast, very well produced, you can get a lot of attention on this issue. And I think it should, because in terms of this issue, I mean, this was for the audience who don't know about this. This is back in 1967. This is during the 6-Day War. We had a ship that was placed. It's a spy ship that was in the Sinai Peninsula in international waters, and it was attacked by Israeli fighter jets as well as torpedo boats. And it was almost immediately written off as a mistake. Israel said, "Oh, we've mistaken you for an Egyptian ship. That's our bad." And both sides moved on very quickly. Israel won that war quite handily. So the U.S. was kind of keen to support. And that's when the U.S. really got entangled and became a much stronger ally to Israel after their decisive victory in that war. But when you look at the evidence, and I've looked at a lot of evidence, I've produced a documentary about 25 minutes long, looking into the Liberty, as well as taking the testimony of Phil Turney and some of the evidence that's out there. There's a couple of weird things, and I'll just kind of introduce that to your audience here, and maybe they can look it up a little bit more. But based on what the crew is saying, they were sent there deliberately. There's something going on even with them being there in the first place. And then after they were attacked, they had multiple distress calls to ships nearby. I think it was the 6th Fleet was nearby, which could come rescue. And based on the testimony and some evidence, President Johnson and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara recalled rescue planes several times during that stretch. So they didn't allow, for some reason, the rescue planes to go there. That signals some sort of intent for that ship to sink.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who ask, well, why didn't it sink? And this is what Phil told me, essentially, is that they were able to get out some calls. They were able to identify the attackers. In a sense, if they were to carry it through after that, that would be then, there would be no question that it was on purpose, right? Once you hear, hey, this is an American ship, there's radio communication out there, Israel now knows it's an American ship.
Yeah.
You can't continue on with the attack. So I think that's probably the most likely theory around that. There's a lot of questions around that particular point still. And then there's more things that came out to say, hey, the head of Mossad met with U.S. officials, including Defense Secretary McNamara, as well as James Angleton, who I can't remember his exact position in the CIA at the time, but it was pretty high up. And they more or less were coordinating something going on here with that ship and how to pull the U.S. into that war if necessary against Egypt. There were also reports of of bombers that were ready to go that morning, even before the attack happened. This is documented that there were these guys that were flying bombers and said they alarm sounded in the morning. They were in their cockpit, ready to go, ready to take off. And they waited there for hours, they said. And eventually they were given sort of the no-go signal and they did not take off. So that is another really weird piece of evidence of they were out there before the attack and they were just waiting. And then what we know transpired, right? The ship didn't sink. They was able to go back to port. There were some survivors, that kind of. So it looked a lot like some sort of botched plan.
Yeah.
And then,
or like a setup, right? Like it almost looked like a setup, and it looked like, why is Israel attacking a United States, fleet ship? All right. You know what? I'm going to have to watch your documentary and then maybe pull your documentary and do a whole episode on yours. The one Candace Owens did, the one Jake Shields did. Maybe I'll splice those together. All right. I know you're a little pressed for time. I'm trying to think. Listen, anything else you want to kind of, any passion topic, or is there anything you want to impart on, maybe what you see happening in 2025? And then I definitely want you to tell everybody where they can find you and what your platform, preference is and all that. But yeah, maybe what do you think is going to happen in 2025?
Yeah. Well, first off, I appreciate you, Ray, for having me on. I'm sorry I don't have more time with you today. I think, if you're happy to have me back, I'm happy to come back, spend
Absolutely
a couple hours with you and dive into all kinds of different things. But in terms of 2025, what I want to say is, what I want to focus on is this information warfare that we see happening, right? We talk about TikTok, we talk about Luige Mangione with potentially using terrorism to subvert people's speech and this and that. There's going to be a huge continuing battle of who controls the information flow and how much, I'm going to use the term, the empire is going to lay the hammer down, because we're starting to see this. I think 2024 election was a very clear sign that mainstream media has sort of lost its ability to control the culture, control narratives, right? Because if you just watch mainstream media, you would, I think, 100% believe that Kamala was going to win in a landslide. But that didn't happen. And so now there's sort of a reckoning that's happening that, okay, what are we going to do? I mean, they're not going to just go quietly into the night. What is their next step to still try to maintain a grip over what Americans think? And bringing in a comment I heard from comedian Tim Dillon, he had a really good comment where he said Hollywood and all these elite, media people, they don't really have the means to control what people think anymore. Because by the time mainstream media says something or Hollywood has made a documentary about it, I have already, or a bunch of creators have already made 7 other documentaries that are available on YouTube. That's much faster. And we can disseminate things. We're much more agile, right? Even if it's just, I'm just me. I have no production team. It's just me. And even that, I can produce content, let's say a documentary, if I want to dive into something, I can do it about a week's time. Hollywood, it takes them 6 months, a year to make a documentary. So I think that's something that we should really be looking into as far as, okay, what's going to happen to the control of information? Because now we're starting to also see, because of the rise of independent media, how are they going to control these independent people? Are they going to co-opt? I'm seeing in the background, right, people being offered large sums of money to say, okay, well, you can keep your independent show. Let's say you're starting a show, Ray. You can still call it, whatever you want, deep, shallow dive podcast. We'll let you do it. You'll look completely independent. You'll have complete editorial control. We'll fund your studio. We'll do this and that. Except there's 2 issues that we don't want you to touch. Let's say it's Israel, and it's anything to do with Ukraine. I'm just making stuff up.
Yeah.
And then, or we'd like you to cover it in this way. But other than that, you're independent. And this is just not disclosed to the public. Like, you just seem like you're talking and giving your audience the truth. But in reality, your show is being completely funded by the same mainstream apparatus that's controlling the corporate media now. And I think we're starting to see some of that happening. You could see it. I think, was it Tim Pool that just sold his show to the Daily Wire right now?
Okay. Yeah. I think it was.
And so, okay, so then that means, then the Daily Wire, it seems like an independent organization, but they're legacy media based,
Absolutely.
in my opinion. And so that's what I want people to pay attention to, is that, when you find, looking for information, really verifying the source of that information, the funding behind it, because I think you're going to start to see this type of background maneuvering to control independent media. They're going to try to pick off the guys one by one and create a new legacy media cast to disseminate information that's not truly independent. So I think that's something to watch out for in 2025. As we've now clearly demonstrated that nobody's watching MSNBC, when nobody's watching, ABC, nobody's watching CNN anymore. It's all kind of a hoax. What are these guys going to do to take over the independent space?
No, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. And right now, that middle layer independent space, Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, the bigger names. I think we all fall underneath those guys.
Sure.
Yeah. If we start seeing goofiness out of that layer, then that layer is compromised. And then it's going to require the layer below it to be the truth tellers. All right, dude, absolutely fantastic. I know you have a hard stopper. Well, seriously, I'd go on for like 2 more hours. Would love to have you back. I will get all your handles on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram. I'll put them all for everybody.
The handle is very easy for everybody. It's 5149 James Lee, Lee spelled with an I, L-I. 5149 James Lee. It's the same on every single platform. I'm on YouTube, where you can find a little bit more of a longer documentary style deep dive, 15, 20, 25 minutes long. And then I'm also doing kind of more short form content where it's more topical information, what I've seen in the day. I produce a lot of those every single week. So that's on Instagram, that is on X, that is on TikTok still for now. So whatever, people like, you like the shorter stuff, you can go there. But if you want the deeper dive, I got the YouTube as well.
The YouTube. Okay.
Yeah. So
all
definitely
right, perfect, man.
Check it out.
I will keep amplifying it, man. I love it. Seriously, I truly respect the quality of your content. So hang on the line. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this. James is going to be back, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Ray. Appreciate you having me
Thanks,
on.
buddy. All right.
This episode was brought to you by the new book, Deep Shallow Dive Into You, available now on Amazon and Barnes & Noble in hardcover and paperback. Don't forget to sign up for our new mailing list on our website at deepshallowdive.com.